The heat in the sauna was thick, the air humid and dense, creating a soft mist that clung to the wooden walls inside. The gentle hiss of water hitting the hot stones added a rhythmic backdrop to the otherwise quiet room. In one corner, a woman sat with her back against the warm wooden slats, her eyes closed in relaxation. She was in her early 40s, her skin glistening slightly with sweat. Her stepson had joined her earlier, sitting across from her, both of them wrapped in towels. He had been silent most of the time, feeling the tension in the room. It wasn't the first time they'd been alone together, but something about the intimate, enclosed space of the SAA made the air feel different, more charged. His eyes flickered to her now and then, catching the way her chest rose and fell with her deep breaths, the beads of sweat tracing along her collarbone and down her neck. "You okay over there?" Her voice broke the silence, soft but with a hint of playfulness. She opened her eyes and caught him staring, a smile playing at her lips. "Yeah, just hot in here," he replied, shifting a bit uncomfortably. She chuckled, leaning forward slightly, the movement causing her towel to slip just enough to expose more of her shoulder. "That's the point of a SAA," she teased. His eyes followed the movement, his heart thumping a little harder in his chest. He quickly averted his gaze, trying to focus on anything but the proximity of their bodies, the way the heat seemed to intensify, not just from the steam but from the unspoken tension between them. "You seem quiet today," she continued, her tone gentle, almost coaxing. "Something on your mind?" He hesitated, not sure how to answer without revealing too much. "Just thinking about stuff," he said vaguely, running a hand through his damp hair. She leaned back again, this time resting her head against the wall and closing her eyes once more. "You can talk to me. You know about anything. We've always been able to talk, haven't we?" He nodded, though she couldn't see it. "Yeah, we have." There was a long pause, the sound of the steam hissing quietly filling the space between them. He was about to speak, maybe change the subject, when she shifted again, her towel slipping slightly lower, exposing the curve of her shoulder completely. "Now maybe it's just the heat," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper now, "but it feels different in here, doesn't it?" His breath caught in his throat. "Yeah, it does." She opened her eyes meeting his gaze directly. For the first time there was something in her look, something that hadn't been there before. She smiled, slow and deliberate, like she knew exactly what he was thinking. "Come sit next to me," she said, patting the space on the bench beside her. He hesitated for a moment, but then stood and crossed the short distance between them, sitting down close enough that their legs almost touched. The heat from her skin combined with the steamy air made his pulse quicken. For a few moments neither of them spoke. She tilted her head back, exposing more of her neck, and let out a soft sigh. "You know, I think about how much you've grown up," she murmured, her voice low and almost intimate. "You're not that kid anymore." His throat felt dry, but it wasn't from the heat. "You've always been there for me," he said quietly, his eyes fixed on her, trying to decipher what was happening. "And I always will be," she replied, her voice soft but carrying weight. The silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. There was a palpable charge in the air, something unspoken but very much felt by both of them. "I should probably go," he said suddenly, but didn't move. It felt like the right thing to say, but everything in him was screaming to stay. She turned her head to look at him, her eyes lingering on his face before trailing down slightly. "Or you could stay," she whispered, barely audible but unmistakable. His breath hitched. He didn't know what to say, or maybe he did, but the words were caught in his throat. The closeness between them, the heat, the soft glow of the sounder light, everything seemed to blur together. She reached out, her fingers lightly brushing his hand. It's okay, she whispered, her voice carrying a mix of reassurance and something else. Something deeper, something more. He swallowed hard. The touch of her hand sending a jolt of electricity through him. This feels different, he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Whisper, it does, she agreed, her hand lingering on his, her thumb gently brushing his skin. But maybe different isn't bad. He turned to look at her, their faces inches apart now, the heat, the tension, the closeness, it was all too much. Without thinking, he leaned in just enough that their foreheads touched. She didn't pull away, didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned into the moment, her breath warm against his lips. The steam hissed again, filling the side with its constant whisper, but neither of them paid any attention. The only thing that mattered was the space between them, the space that was rapidly closing. Her hand slid up his arm, slow and deliberate, until it rested on the back of his neck. He shuddered under her touch, his body reacting to the closeness, the intimacy of the moment. This feels, he began, but the words failed him. I know, she whispered, her lips brushing against his in the faintest, softest kiss. I know. It was a moment suspended in time, the heat of the sound a blending with the heat between them. Doty moment between them stretched, charged with unspoken tension. Her lips had barely brushed his, and yet the weight of that contact sent shock waves through him. It wasn't just the kiss, it was the knowledge of what it meant, the line they were tiptoeing closer to crossing. He froze for a second, unsure of whether to pull back or dive in, but his body seemed to make the choice for him. She pulled away first, but only by a breath. Her eyes searched his wide and questioning, as though she were silently asking for permission to continue. He swallowed hard, his pulse pounding in his ears. We shouldn't be doing this, he managed to say, his voice low and husky. Yet even as the words left his lips, his body betrayed him. He hadn't moved away. In fact, he leaned in just a fraction more, his gaze flickering down to her lips once again. I know, she whispered back, her voice barely audible above the quiet hiss of the sauna, but it feels like she trailed off, not quite able to find the right words. Her hand remained on the back of his neck, her fingers playing with the damp strands of his hair. Without another word, she leaned in once more, this time pressing her lips against his with a little more intent. It wasn't a hurried kiss, but it carried weight, as if all the unspoken feelings between them had been building to this point. He responded instinctively, his hand finding her waist, pulling her close, the warmth of her skin against his, setting his nerves on fire. The kiss deepened slowly, their breaths mingling in the humid air. Her body pressed against his, and the towel that had barely clung to her began to loosen even further, slipping dangerously low. He felt her body move beneath his touch, the heat of her skin combining with the steam to create a heady mix of sensations. As his hands explored her waist, she tilted her head, allowing him to kiss along the curve of her neck, each touch sending shivers down her spine. She let out a quiet sigh, her fingers gripping his shoulders as he trailed his lips lower, the tension between them building with every second. Are you sure about this, he murmured against her skin, his voice thick with desire but tinged with hesitation. Despite the intensity of the moment, part of him still couldn't believe they were here doing this. She pulled back slightly, looking him in the eye. I've never been more sure of anything, she whispered, and before he could question it any further. She leaned in for another kiss, this one hungrier than the last. His hands moved down her back, finding the knot of her towel. Without thinking, he tugged gently and the fabric slipped away, exposing her fully to him. She gasped softly but made no move to stop him. Instead, she let the towel fall away completely, leaving her vulnerable, and yet the look in her eyes told him she had never felt more in control. He could hardly breathe, his heart racing as his hands explored her bare skin. She pressed herself closer, her body responding to his touch as they continued to kiss, their movements slow and deliberate as though they had all the time in the world. The heat of the S seemed to intensify the sensations, every touch feeling magnified. "You're so beautiful," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion as his hands roamed her body, feeling the curve of her waist and the softness of her skin. She smiled at him, her lips curving up in a way that made his heart race even faster. "You always say the right thing," she teased lightly, though there was a seriousness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. For a moment they simply held each other, their foreheads resting together, their breaths coming in shallow gasps. The sounder was quiet except for the gentle sound of the steam and the thumping of their hearts. She shifted then, her leg brushing against his as she adjusted her position, causing a jolt of sensation to shoot through him. He responded by pulling her even closer, their bodies flush against each other now, and her towel, which had been hanging on by a thread, slipped further down, leaving her entirely exposed in the humid heat. She didn't seem to mind. If anything, the vulnerability seemed to embolden her. She leaned back against the warm wooden wall, pulling him with her. Her hands found the knot of his towel, and with one quick tug it unraveled. Falling away, he gasped, his heart pounding as he felt the sensation of her body against his, unimpeded by fabric. The heat of the SAA combined with the heat of her skin was overwhelming. It felt as though the walls were closing in, the air thick and heady with the scent of sweat and desire. For a moment they just stood there, pressed against each other, breathing heavily. The intensity of the moment was dizzying. Neither of them could speak, their eyes locked as they tried to process what was happening. But then her hands were on him again, exploring his chest, his arms, her touch light and teasing. He groaned softly, his hands trailing down her back, tracing the curve of her spine. It felt as though he was losing control, the desire that had been simmering between them for so long finally bubbling over. She leaned in, pressing her lips to his neck, her breath hot against his skin. He shuddered, his fingers digging into her hips as he pulled her even closer, their bodies pressed together as though they were one. "Are you okay?" she whispered, her voice low and breathless. "Is this okay?" He nodded, unable to speak, his eyes wide as he looked at her. She smiled softly, leaning in for another kiss, this one deeper, more urgent. They sank down onto the bench, their bodies moving together in a rhythm that felt instinctual, primal. The heat of the SAA made everything feel more intense, their skin slick with sweat, their breaths coming in ragged gasps as they explored each other's bodies. Time seemed to blur as they continued, each touch, each kiss drawing them closer together. The steam in the SAA had long since dissipated, but the heat between them only grew stronger. It was as though the world outside the small wooden room ceased to exist, leaving just the two of them, lost in the moment. After what felt like hours, they finally slowed, their bodies exhausted but satisfied. She rested her head on his chest, their legs tangled together as they lay on the bench, the afterglow of their shared Experience washing over them, he rapped. His arms around her, pulling her close as they lay there, the silence of the sounder now comforting, almost peaceful. That was he began but couldn't find the words. She smiled up at him, her eyes soft and content. Yes, she murmured, her voice drowsy with satisfaction. It was. They lay there for a long time, neither of them speaking, just enjoying the warmth of each other's presence. The tension that had hung over them for so long was gone, replaced by a quiet understanding, a bond that went beyond words. Finally she shifted, sitting up and reaching for her towel. We should probably get out of here before we pass out from the heat, she said with a light laugh. He smiled, nodding as he reached for his own towel. Yeah, you're right. They dressed in silence, the intimacy of the moment lingering in the air between them. But there was no awkwardness, no regret. Just a quiet understanding that something between them had changed as they stepped out of the SAA and into the cool air of the house. He glanced at her, unsure of what to say, unsure of what came next, but she smiled at him, her eyes soft and warm. We'll figure it out, she said simply, as though reading his thoughts, and somehow he knew they would.